Ozempic is marketed as a weight loss drug, but it's actually a drug that alters your brain chemistry. And it is Big Pharma's big ploy to be able to control Americans. It's actually something that's designed to hijack the brain with sinister intentions, in my opinion, as somebody who works with people one-on-one in my fitness coaching company, Default Kings. I see that the impacts of Ozempic are much deeper than just the gastrointestinal issues. They're much deeper than the metabolism crashing issues. They're even much deeper than the fact that most people who end up taking Ozempic are off of it in 3 months, even though it's covered by insurance and they don't have to pay anything out of pocket. But noticing the signs of depression, the suicidal ideation, and the numbness that people are experiencing to what seems to be their own spirits is it's terrifying, the impacts that I'm seeing of this drug in the industry right now. So I felt it necessary to make a video on this because if you are somebody who is overweight, which is extremely likely given the fact that with the obesity crisis in America right now, 50% of teens are considered overweight. Right now, 75+% of adults are considered overweight. If you fall into that category, which is more likely than not, then you're probably already experiencing doctors starting to highly encourage you to take these drugs. I know that they might come across as a quick fix or as a solution to a very severe problem that you're facing or as a necessary evil to the risk that you're experiencing of being overweight. But again, I'm making this video as a warning so that you do not experience the negative implications with these drugs that go far, far, far beyond just the physical side of it. So I'm going to be diving into a few things here in this video. If you see me glancing on my laptop here, it's because there are some really important notes I want to hit on, and there are notes that I have taken after doing lots of research on the subject, as well as, again, experiencing and hearing the real life stories from the people that I work with. So very important subject here. This is something that you'll want to take notes on if you're, I guess, on my team and don't want most Americans to fall victim to Big Pharma's plan here. This is also something that if you are currently overweight and you are starting to be encouraged to take these drugs, or if you're actively taking these drugs, I want you to just sit back and listen to this message with an open heart. Because again, I think that the potential risks are much deeper than just the negative health outcomes that can come from these drugs. And if you're currently on these drugs, I want to offer you some encouragement to get off of these drugs, as well as a perspective that I think is going to empower you to be able to lose the weight and keep it off without relying on a pharmaceutical band-aid for a much deeper wound that has led to gaining. So my prayer is that this video offers you hope, obviously offers you some education here. And ultimately, I just want to empower people to experience the goodness that God has for them on the other side of being able to lose this weight without this drug or drugs like it. So without further ado, let's sit back. First thing I want to do is paint the context here for why I think this is such a big push by Big Pharma. And that is because of the obesity crisis. Now, you can probably notice this on your own without even having to hear the statistics just by looking around. But most Americans at this point in time, the majority of Americans are now considered overweight or obese. So being overweight or obese is no longer something that is weird. It's no longer something that's taboo. It's not even something that is average. It is something that is the majority of the American experience. Most Americans are considered overweight or obese. I touched on this earlier, but 50% of teenagers now are considered overweight, which is a BMI above 24.9. And there's some criticism around that BMI scale, but it is actually something that is very accurate in terms of a measurement to determine if you're considered overweight and if you have comorbidities that you'll be facing because of your. So anything over 25.4 25.9, 24.9 BMI is considered overweight. 50% of the teens are now in that category. Now, something that comes along with that is pre-diabetes. 33% of teens are now considered pre-diabetic, which diabetes plays in a massive role into this entire Ozempic situation and these semaglutide drugs, but 33% of teenagers are now considered pre-diabetic. Also, with adults, over 50% of adults are considered pre-diabetic. 75+% of adults in the United States are in that overweight or obese category. So this is something that is beyond, again, just fat loss. This is not something that is a fad. This is not something that, is here today, gone tomorrow. This is so much bigger than any of the other weight loss pushes that have ever flooded the United States, just overall conversation and what the populace is focused on. There's been so many different fad diet pushes. There's been the keto push. There's been the paleo push. There's been the carnivore push right now, which is not as hijacked as some of the others, but still harmful for very similar reasons. But Ozempic is behind a push that is literally going to affect most of Americans. Again, not some people. It's not going to be a drug that some people are on. This is going to be a drug that most Americans, including 50% of teenagers, will be encouraged to start taking this drug because of the obesity epidemic. And there is an astounding amount of financial incentive for the medical system to be doing this. One of the most shocking aspects of this entire Ozempic push is the fact that because it's a drug that would be taken by, upwards of 75 to 80% of the populace, the companies that make these drugs are colluding with the government to create scenarios in which this drug has to be taken. For example, with the government of the United States has food subsidy programs where there is large amounts of funding that go into people being able to buy food stamps, this type of thing. And what's really interesting is that the majority of foods that are actually purchased with food stamps, as in the majority of foods that are funded by the government for people to consume, are sodas, are highly addictive, highly sugary, extremely high calorie drinks that are highly correlated with people who end up in the obese category, who will then have to be taking this drug, which funds the pharmaceutical companies. And so there's a lot of push to be able to do this. In fact, the company Novo Nordisk that is running this entire Ozempic campaign, which is a European-based company, sees America as its largest consumer, as its largest potential consumer of the Ozempic drug, while countries in Europe, again, this is a European country, while countries in Europe do not even allow people to take Ozempic. So the country of origin of the company that is running this entire campaign is viewing the potential negative harmful outcomes of this drug, and then looking at us in America and saying, they're stupid enough to fall for it, so we're going to capitalize on the Americans because they're stupid enough to fall for it. So we can be funded by the Americans. So there's a lot of collusion happening here between the government and these pharmaceutical companies. Again, this is why it is going to start to be almost shocking if you are overweight. You've probably already experienced this at 2025, June 6th, 2025. But it's going to be shocking how doctors start to recommend this, encourage this, and you're going to be asking them questions like, what about the side effects? What about my gut? What about all these things people are reporting with suicidal ideation, which I'm going to get into in a second here. And the doctors are going to tell you, yes, this is a lifetime drug that you're going to have to take. Yes, there are potential side effects, but that is just the necessary evil that you have to deal with because you're overweight. This is something that I had a client recently tell me who is actually currently on one of these drugs and is working with us to develop a plan to be able to get off of these drugs safely while continuing to lose weight. And what he told me was that the doctor told him that in the face of all of these potential negative outcomes associated with these drugs, it was necessary for him to inject himself with Ozempic for life so that he can lose the weight. And what's crazy is that this might seem new and this might seem like this crazy new evil sinister plan, but this has been something that the pharmaceutical industry has been attempting to do for decades. Ozempic is just their new poster boy, but this is something that's been going on in the diabetes world for decades. The American Diabetes Association itself has said publicly that for patients who are struggling with diabetes, who are taking diabetes drugs, which Ozempic is now part of this cocktail of diabetes drugs that people are prescribed, for people who are taking these diabetes drugs, that they actually don't have to make any lifestyle choices. any changes with their food intake, that they can continue eating as normal. And so long as they take these drugs, then, their bodily system is going to be able to handle what it is that they're eating. But this is not true in the long term. This is something that actually initiated my own passion for health and fitness and inspired me to start studying this stuff from my high school years. And it's because my own father was one of the victims of this system. He had diabetes from the time he was 35 or so, maybe a little bit younger, but he struggled with diabetes as I was a kid growing up. It was just kind of the norm, seeing him in and out of the hospital, watching my dad, from again, the ages of like 5 years old, watching my dad inject himself daily with a needle so that he can put this thing into his body to make it possible for him to continue eating without dying. That was insulin. He was on insulin. And I remember when I was a teenager coming home one day, and my dad was home while I just got home from school, which was kind of weird, but he had a doctor's appointment, and he was looking through the fridge, and I asked him how his doctor's appointment went. And my dad looked at me and almost jokingly said, "Son, you know what's crazy? My doctor said that I am on the highest dose of insulin that he has ever prescribed anyone." And I don't know if my dad thought that this would be a funny joke to tell me, or if he was kind of just coping with the fact that he's on the highest dose of insulin ever. But when I heard this, it really started to sink in that insulin and any of the drugs that the American Diabetes Association is pushing as a solution to these problems, none of these are in anyone's mind an actual long-term solution. And you can see this in the statistics, because as the statistics of people who are on these drugs, on insulin, on things like Ozempic, on statins, on these heart health and these heart disease and these blood pressure medications, as the users and the dosages have gone up, the instances of obesity and the instances of these comorbidities related to obesity, like heart attacks and strokes and Alzheimer's, have also gone up. The instances of the conditions that these drugs are marketed to solve have gone up with the uses of these drugs. And the pharmaceutical companies know this. They know that these drugs are not a long-term solution. My dad's doctor, who's prescribing him insulin at increasing dosages over the course of his life, absolutely knew without question that that was not the long-term solution. This is one of the first things that we learn in the medical field, that insulin is not a long-term solution to diabetes. This is one of the first things I learned. I remember in high school, I enrolled myself in this biomedical science education track in Florida called the BASE program, where you're taking like multiple classes throughout your day. They're focused on learning about the root cause of the disease. It's basically for a bunch of kids who just want to be doctors. And that's what I wanted to do originally growing up, until I realized just the corruption of the system. But I'm in this class with a bunch of other kids who want to be doctors. Think like the people in the school who are going to Harvard and Yale, which I was not part of that group, but I was there with them. I remember spending about a week learning specifically about diabetes in one of these classes. Again, high school level, entry level education on what diabetes is and the use of insulin in diabetes. And the conclusion of this segment of the class was that diabetes is something that is 100% reversible and preventable with lifestyle changes, because diabetes is ultimately insulin resistance. What creates insulin resistance is when you're overeating, and so your pancreas has to continue secreting exorbitant amounts of insulin, and you're almost ramming your cells with so much insulin that they just become resistant to it and become almost numb to your own signaling for keeping the body healthy and processing these foods. The other lifestyle choice that can impact insulin resistance is by building more lean muscle, is by exercising, strength training, because the muscle tissue on your body is the tissue on your body that is the most insulin sensitive, which means that even when you have higher secretions of insulin, and even when you're eating more food, if you have lean muscle, your body's more capable of processing the food, which means you're not going to end up diabetic, insulin resistant, and ultimately experiencing all the side effects that come with that. When doctors prescribe insulin, what they're doing is artificially injecting this necessary thing that takes glucose out of the bloodstream so that you don't die from having hyperglycemia. But that has to happen because your pancreas got so overworked from having to produce so much insulin, and your cells became so numb to that insulin signaling, that your pancreas just essentially shuts down and cannot produce enough insulin to get past your body's own resistance to your body's own insulin. And so you have to inject more and more and more and more because your pancreas can't do enough. But as you can imagine, because the whole problem was that your pancreas was chronically secreting so much insulin that your body became resistant to its own insulin, when you just inject more insulin, it only worsens the insulin resistance. So the solution to diabetes, this thing that people are injecting themselves with, billions of dollars a year industry, actually literally worsened the condition. When you look at this at a mechanistic level, which I don't want to get too deep here because this isn't a biology class, but one of the first things you learn as anyone who is interested in any kind of health profession, one of the first things you learn is that insulin does not cure diabetes and literally worsens the issue that causes diabetes, which is a condition that now is on track to affect 50% of teenagers. The solution by the government and the pharmaceutical industry worsens the condition because it makes you more insulin resistant over time. And again, the recommendation, American Diabetes Association, you don't have to make any changes to what you're eating so long as you're taking these drugs. Okay. So this is a repeated thing that's been going on for decades. Ozempic is just a poster point. It's not new. The agenda is the same. The agenda has been there for a long time. Ozempic is just their new weapon. These new semaglutide drugs, right? With this new mechanism. Now, I want to get into Ozempic specifically because the side effects of Ozempic are absolutely insane. And so, although it is being marketed as this new, alternative, it is more powerful than insulin ever was. And it's also more harmful than insulin could ever be. Although insulin literally worsens your insulin sensitivity, giving you diabetes. So the crazy thing about Ozempic is that as of now, it's something that in certain categories, most people are getting this covered by insurance, right? Because it's a $20,000 a year cost to be taking this drug. So most people, the average American, is getting this covered by insurance. And even with most Americans getting Ozempic covered by insurance, there is currently a 33% dropout rate with users of Ozempic within the first 90 days. And it's not to do really with cost. What this has to do with is the negative side effects of Ozempic. So I'm going to get into what Ozempic is here and how it affects you. Ozempic, the mechanism here to keep this simple, Ozempic is a drug that works via digestion inhibition. And so what you need to understand here is that your digestive system, your intestines, so on and so forth, these are actually muscles that contract and relax just like any other muscle in your body, obviously involuntarily. So you're not thinking about contracting and relaxing the muscles of your digestive system, but they're muscles that need to contract and relax to work. Now, what Ozempic does is it inhibits the contraction and relaxation of those muscles, which means that it's slowing down your digestion drastically. This is the mechanism that Ozempic uses and all these other semaglutide. What that means is because you're digesting food much more slowly, when you eat very tiny amounts of food, are extremely full. Okay. And so your normal hunger signaling while you're taking these drugs starts to go away. You're not secreting as much ghrelin, which is the grr, I'm hungry hormone, because you're constantly over full. But it's not because you're eating normal amounts of food. It is because you are slowing your digestion drastically. It's like literally what this does, and this is one of the side effects, is it makes you backed up. It makes you constipated. And so people start to experience extreme cases of indigestion when they take these drugs. People start to experience extreme cases of constipation when they experience these drugs, and they get backed up, and it causes issues. It causes discomfort, obviously. Again, the way that this works is it slows your digestion, which is why when people take these drugs, they report, looking at food and not even being able to imagine consuming that food. Okay. Now, the outcomes of this can be very serious. And I'm going to touch on how this affects brain chemistry in a second, which in my opinion is the wildest outcome because the gut is almost like the second brain, but I'll get to that in a second. Some other outcomes that can come from taking these semaglutide drugs like Ozempic are when you're affecting your digestion to the point at which you don't want to eat normal amounts of food, what happens is you don't eat normal amounts of food. You don't eat sufficient protein because you can't even imagine putting it into your mouth when you're on these drugs. And you start to experience micronutrient deficiencies, which means that you're missing out on the basic nutrients for just your normal brain and body to function. So being on Ozempic can cause you to eat in a way that your normal bodily functions start to get disrupted, even outside of just the gut. The other thing that happens is because you're not eating sufficient amounts of protein and also you're experiencing this massive influx of not wanting to eat, and so you're probably not working out, is that you start to experience a rapid muscle loss, rapid muscle atrophy when you take these drugs. So even in cases of people who are losing weight when they take these drugs, they're usually losing lots of muscle with that, which, like we touched on earlier with the diabetes issue, losing muscle ends up hurting your insulin sensitivity because your muscle is the most insulin sensitive tissue on your body, meaning that taking Ozempic, although it can reduce cases of diabetes in the short term, if people get off of these drugs, once they lose the weight and they no longer have that muscle and they haven't had a change to their habits, so they go right back to the way they were eating before, and their metabolism has crashed because they have no muscle and they're not burning any calories, then they're in a worse position and they're more vulnerable to becoming diabetic after taking the drug than they were before. This is why I'm very against the arguments of the pragmatic people who trust Big Pharma and don't think about the logical implications of things, who say, if somebody needs to take Ozempic to save their life, then they should just do it. Yeah, it's not ideal, but they should just do it. I don't agree with that. Because what happens when you take Ozempic is you're worse off than you were before in every possible way, from your digestive system to your insulin sensitivity, not to mention the way that this impacts people psychologically when they get off these drugs and they end up gaining all the way back and then some. That sense of failure in someone's life after implementing such a drastic decision is going to make them feel defeated. It's going to be evidence to their mind that they cannot keep the weight off. And what happens in most of those cases, evidenced by the obesity epidemic, is that they're going to continue gaining weight and they're not going to ever lose it or keep it off. And that is not Gabe's opinion. That is evidenced by the rising cases of obesity, the rising cases of all these comorbidities that are killing people early. So, no, I don't think that you should take these drugs. I don't think that it's even worth it right now if you're overweight and you need to lose the weight. I think you need to lose weight as soon as possible, obviously, because you're walking around and your heart is a ticking time bomb, not to mention other issues. But Ozempic is not the solution. It is absolutely not the solution. I do not agree with anybody who recommends this ever in any way, shape, or form, literally ever. I think this does way more harm than good. And even if you die because you are overweight, I think it is better to have died trying than to be a victim to Big Pharma's push to control you, because you're probably going to die from this anyway, realistically. And who are you going to be? Or are people going to remember you as? Who is it that you want your life? How do you want your life to be remembered? I think there's an issue here because this goes so much deeper than just the pharmaceutical impacts, because people ultimately want to live as long of a life as possible. And I'm not saying there's anything bad with wanting to live as long of a life as possible. I think there is utility in living a long, healthy life. Obviously, I have a fitness coaching company. I think there are blessings that come from living a long, healthy life. I think there are things that God wants to do with long, healthy, high energy lives. But living a long life here on earth, as long of a life as possible by any means necessary, is actually something that stems from a fear that human beings have of dying. Human beings have a fear of dying because we all inherently, in my opinion, know that there is a place we all go when we die, one of two places. And human beings have a fear of dying. That's why people like Brian Johnson, who's this guy who his whole brand, apart from being weird, is however many millions a year he spends on optimizing his health with all these weird methods, which I have no problem with the investment amount there. But what I do have a problem with is his methods. His entire tagline is "Don't die," and he tweets about how we're going to overcome death in this lifetime. And again, although I am pro health, obviously, and pro long, healthy life. The heart posture in which that comes from matters. The motive of living a long, healthy life matters. We should be living long, healthy lives so that we can do and be all God created us to be, so that we can glorify Him and serve His people. We should not be wanting to live long, healthy lives for sake of not dying, which is Brian Johnson's entire MO there. Don't die. So I think that one of the human issues that leads to people wanting to take these drugs is don't die. Don't die by any means necessary. Don't die, because they don't understand that the God of the universe has already defeated death. So that's that. Anyway, where were we? Ozempic messes you up deeply. Let me attempt to, I close the loops here. Messes you up deeply, messes up your digestive system, messes up your metabolism. You are worse off than before when you take these drugs. You are more vulnerable to these comorbidities after taking these drugs than you were even before taking these drugs. I do not think that people should take these as a solution to lose weight at all. Let's continue. What I think one of the most harmful impacts of Ozempic is its impact on your brain chemistry. Now, what I'm not saying is that Ozempic is something that you can direct directly into your brain, or that the drug itself even directly impacts the brain. The drug itself, again, impacts the digestive system. It impacts the gut. But the problem with this is that 95% of your body's serotonin production actually takes place in the gut. 95% of your body's serotonin production takes place in the gut. And serotonin is a neurotransmitter, which is something that sends signals between brain cells. It's a neurotransmitter that essentially controls mood. Right? And this explains why people who take Ozempic explain suicidal ideation. They explain cases of depression. One of the reasons why 30% of the people who start taking this drug are off it within 3 months because they can't take it anymore, why they experience mood swings. But when you're taking a drug that alters your digestion so drastically and messes up your gut so drastically, you are now messing with something that interfaces with your brain in a way that affects your mood drastically. And I'm not saying that you don't produce enough serotonin, and so now, serotonin's not getting to your brain from your gut. That's not how this works. But there are signaling pathways from the gut to the brain and the nervous system that are drastically impacted when your gut is not producing sufficient serotonin. There are signaling pathways from the brain to the gut and the nervous system where, when your gut is disrupted, it sends signals to your brain of high stress, fight or flight. And again, when you're disrupting the gut this much via something like Ozempic, when you're literally paralyzing the gut, inhibiting this serotonin production, it's going to affect your mood drastically. And maybe because you were 400 pounds, you were already depressed, and so you don't even notice the impact that Ozempic has on your mood. But this is something that numbs Americans and users to be able to be sensitive to their own emotions, to their own brain chemistry, which is harmful. I think that this is part of Big Pharma's ploy to be able to control Americans, apart from everything we already talked about and the funding and the government subsidies and all these things. When Americans are not just weak physically because of their health issues, but also then weak mentally because of how their health impacts their mind, then you truly have a population that is capable of being controlled. And you have something that is very, very harmful. Okay. Now, I think that this goes even deeper than just the government or Big Pharma or mind control and societal control. I think those things are obvious. If you disagree with that at this point in time, after everything that happened with the jab, I'm not sure if I can say that on YouTube, but maybe we're just not on the same page and you're probably not watching this video. I think that part is more relatively obvious. I think what I wanted to communicate there was that Ozempic is part of the pharmaceutical industry's attempt to accomplish what they wanted to accomplish through what happened in 2020 and 2021, but they're attacking it from a different angle here, an angle that actually a higher percentage of people are going to be susceptible to than ever were. Because if you literally just think about the amount of people that even would have been susceptible to worries about the shot, there's more people that are experiencing the issue that this drug claims to solve. And it's going right under our nose. So we touched on some of the the spiritual implications here and why human beings are susceptible to this. What I want to do now is I want to explain at depth what the spirit level problem is for human beings, that for you, if you're, again, most likely, if you're watching this, you're one of the people who falls into the category in which the government and the pharmaceutical industry is going to be targeting you for these drugs. I want to dive into the spiritual realities and implications that are at play that you, in my opinion, need to be aware of so that you can have the strength to say no, and also the strength not just to resist the enemy's push here, but also to be able to take authority over your own health, lose the weight, build muscle, keep it off so that you're healthy, obviously physically, you're not susceptible, you're not a victim to this system, but that's so you're capable of fighting the system long term. Because there are a few spiritual implications that really, really matter here. The spiritual implication that I want to talk on for you is that we have to understand, this is probably something you already believe to a certain extent and already understand in other areas of life, but this is happening in this area of your life too. But as Christians, we believe and we understand that Satan frequently offers counterfeit solutions to the spiritual problems that we're dealing with. Satan offers counterfeit solutions. This is the altars that, the Hebrew people built. They're wandering through the desert for 40 years. Counterfeit gods. This is the altar of Baal, who promised fertility and promised the growth of crops in the Old Testament that people built. All of these counterfeit gods, these counterfeit solutions to our spiritual problems, this is a pattern that Satan will consistently use to try to weaken Christians, to try to weaken believers. And very deep. And it's something that can even numb believers to be able to even rely on the Holy Spirit, to be even able to hear the Holy Spirit when he's communicating with us. So I guess the parallel I want to paint with this is that when you're dealing with obesity isn't actually the problem. It is the symptom of a problem. And the problem that obesity is a symptom of is the sin of gluttony. Gluttony is the sin. Yes, it is a sin. And now we're getting deep here. So hang on tight. This is where you need to sit and listen to this with open heart. Gluttony is a sin that the Bible talks about. And what gluttony is specifically is the sin of over-consuming food that harms the body. It is the sin of over-consuming food that harms the body. And the direct impact of gluttony is obviously obesity, gaining fat, right? We all know this inherently. But where gluttony really comes from is the part of our hearts that is broken, that is ashamed, that is in need of Jesus. Let me explain. I'm going to use a parallel to explain. A parallel that realistically, I don't know the statistics on this, but I would bet that the statistics on this parallel are similar to the statistics on obesity. The parallel I'm going to use here is something that Christians talk about a bit more, that might seem a bit more familiar and might make a bit more sense. Although this is sometimes talked about in the church too. The parallel used here is the struggle of being addicted to pornography. Okay, let's use being addicted to pornography as being addicted to food, which pornography can have a bunch of negative outcomes in your life, like ruining relationships, marriages, like giving you a mind of perversion that leads to you harming others sexually, keeping you alone, and distracting you from your God-given mission in life, right? Lots of harmful outcomes from being addicted to pornography. I know this personally because I was addicted to pornography for over 10 years, and it damaged my view of women. It led me to take behaviors that harmed women, and it distracted me, literally, just on a time basis, with the amount of time I spent watching porn, from executing the things that God had given me to execute on. Okay. Where addiction to pornography stems from is the sin of lust. Okay. So this is like addiction to food, overeating stemming from the sin of gluttony. But lust in and of itself stems from one of the greatest holes in the human heart, which is this need to be loved, right? Because when we lust, when we desire this feeling, this sexual feeling for orgasm, now we're getting PG-13 here, PG-19 probably. That is something that is part of the human condition, because that is like the feeling that comes from intimacy between man and wife. And when we feel lonely, our spirits And our minds, we have this fear that we're never going to experience that communion, that we're never going to experience that level of intimacy. I'm not even just talking about physical intimacy here, but I'm talking about true spiritual intimacy. And so we have to seek the feeling, the counterfeit feeling of that intimacy through pornography, through being able to make ourselves orgasm, through this sin of lust. That's the counterfeit solution that Satan presents to our desire to experience intimacy is, okay, hey, you have this desire to experience intimacy. You're not going to experience it. I'm going to create this fear and this identity around who you are. You will not experience intimacy the way that you desire at a deep level. So go satisfy your desire for intimacy via this vehicle of pornography, lust, satisfying the intimacy yourself. Right. And there's other things I can dive into there, but this is just one example of how this pattern plays out. And it is the same thing with food. It's the same thing with food. I'm not saying that eating food is coming from a desire to feel intimacy, particularly, but there are other desires at play here because all human beings, we do have this desire to feel comfort. And we have this desire to continue surviving, to live long, healthy lives. And when you think about the psychology of cravings in and of themselves, and the fact that cravings don't really have anything to do with actual physical hunger, but they have everything to do with the need for emotional control because you're really seeking out a dopamine hit from the food rather than necessarily filling your belly, which is why you grab food even when you're not hungry. This starts to make sense because if we look at gluttony, the sinful action that leads to obesity, which is what Big Pharma here, is offering a solution to, that stems from people not feeling the comfort that they desire, which, in my opinion, the comfort that we desire from food is something that we should be relying on the Holy Spirit for. It's something that we should be turning to God for because He is our comforter. He is our perfect Father. But when we're not experiencing that, we turn to the counterfeit. We turn to food. We turn to comfort ourselves through this thing that we can control, that we can continue to overindulge in because we're not experiencing the comfort that we desire. And there are a lot of places that need for comfort can come from. Maybe you grew up poor and now you built business and you can eat whatever you want. You don't have to use a calculator at the grocery store. And so now you use food for comfort. It feels good when I get to eat whatever I want. Maybe you have some other stressor going on in your life, like your marriage is messed up or anything else, or you're just stressed from constantly dealing with crap that people give you in business. And so you want to come home and feel good. This is why people come home from these long days of work and say, man, I need a drink. Because inherently, the human brain knows that if we can control our emotion, we can give ourselves that comfort. If we can use this counterfeit God, then we can fill this hole. We think we can fill this hole in our hearts that can only be fully satisfied by God. But it never really works long term, which is why you continue to need more and more and more and more and more, which is why you keep eating, which is why you're fat and obese, which is why you are now in this position where you're either on Ozempic or a similar drug, that you're being targeted to take one of these drugs, or you've been taking it and now you're in a position of vulnerability where you need to get off of it or need a plan to be able to get off of it without getting back. And so there's a lot of deep spiritual implications here. This is exactly what I was going through when I was addicted to porn. I did not have the love that I thought I needed from my father, or I wasn't experiencing that, although I had it. And I was seeking validation from women, from this feeling of lust that was trying to fill that hole in my heart that I had from not feeling like I had that validation from my own father. And the answer wasn't that I needed it from my dad. The answer was that I needed to understand that I already had that perfect love from God. And so to wrap this up, I can go way, way, way longer on this, but I want to wrap up the solution here because at this point, there are really two choices that you can face when it comes to the solution here. Okay. And I'm not going to paint this picture that most people paint of like, you can choose the easy way out or you can choose the hard way out. Okay. Because there's a misconception there. If you are obese right now, you can take these drugs. You may experience all the negative, harmful side effects that we talked about in the beginning of this video. But the worst part is that you're going to be putting a pharmaceutical Band-Aid over your spiritual wounds that have led to overeating in the first place. And you're going to hurt the witness that you have to God's goodness in your life. Because let's say you lose 100 pounds on Ozempic or lose 50 pounds on Ozempic, and your son or grandson asks you, hey, How did you lose that weight? What you're going to have to tell them is, I actually couldn't. I had to take the drug. I had to be a pawn in Big Pharma's machine. I'm part of the problem. I funded this system that is actually trying to mutilate you and convince you that you're a girl when you're really a boy. I funded them. That's what you're going to have to say. Now, if you don't go the Ozempic route, yes, you are going to be faced with dealing with all the dirty parts of your heart and the broken parts of your soul that have led to you overeating, which has led to you becoming obese. You're going to have to deal with that. You're going to have to face that. Yes, that will be scary. Yes, that might be hard. Yes, that's going to require you doing a deeper level of work than you've probably ever done before, crushing your pride and humbling yourself. Yes. But if you go that route, you're going to find that the only solution to the hole in your heart that you're trying to fill with food is the love and incredible grace of Jesus. And when you find that, now you have an actual life-giving energy behind your weight loss efforts, because you get to take part in how Christ disciplined his body as you discipline yours. You get to take part in the sanctification process of becoming more like Jesus and not being slave to gluttony, because he wasn't slave to gluttony. And you have an incredible testimony to tell about what God did in your life after you've lost the weight and people are asking you how. You have a completely different story to tell. And again, this is not about easy versus hard, because there is hard involved in both. This is about what story you want to tell. And here's the real secret here. Relying on the goodness of Jesus to give you authority over your gluttony, which will lead to you no longer being obese. That's actually easier, because the only thing that Jesus requires to work in your life is your surrender. He actually does all the work. And I know this might make no sense, and maybe it does, depending on who you are watching this video. But the reality is that when you choose the route of dealing with your own gluttony, you find that the only answer is Jesus. And when you find that the only answer is Jesus, he does the work on your behalf. You just have to surrender to him. So not that there's no struggles in that route, but it is easier in my mind. So I hope that this busts you. I hope, honestly, that this serves as a little bit of a form of warning and encouragement. And I know at the end here, I opened up a potentially massive discussion on surrendering to Jesus and how that plays a role into you overcoming gluttony, and therefore overcoming obesity, and not being one of the pawns in Big Pharma's machine here, not having your brain chemistry altered by their poster boy drug. And if you want more on that, then watch other videos here on my channel. Follow me on X, because I go deep into that subject all the time. But that is that. Definitely do not take Ozempic. If you're on it right now, get help to find a plan to get off of it safely. And if you've been on it and now you're off, then now here's where the real work begins, right? Here's where we really have to deal with what led to the weight gain in the first place. So I hope this blesses you. Thank you for watching. God bless.